Story 1. I've always been a skeptic when it comes to the paranormal, but something happened to me last summer that I can't rationalize, no matter how hard I try. It was late July, and I was driving cross-country from Oregon to Tennessee for a new job. I'd packed up my life into my beat-up Honda Civic and hit the road, excited for the adventure ahead. The first few days were uneventful. Long stretches of highway, generic rest stops, and endless fields of crops. On the fourth day, I found myself crossing through eastern Colorado as the sun began to set. I'd been pushing myself hard, trying to make good time, but fatigue was starting to set in. The landscape had become increasingly desolate, with fewer and fewer signs of civilization. As darkness fell, I realized I was running dangerously low on gas. My GPS showed the nearest town was still over 50 miles away, and I wasn't sure I'd make it. Just as panic started to creep in, I spotted a faint glow on the horizon. Drawing closer, I saw it was a small gas station with its neon open sign. I pulled off the highway, tires crunching on gravel. The station looked old but well-maintained, a squat cinder block building with two ancient pumps out front. A weather-beaten sign proclaimed, "Last stop for 100 miles" in faded red letters. Relief washed over me as I coasted up to the pump. The lot was empty except for a dusty pickup truck parked off to the side. I figured it must belong to the attendant. As I killed the engine, I noticed how eerily quiet it was. No crickets, no distant traffic, just the oppressive silence that seemed to press in on me from all sides. I shook off the uneasy feeling and got out to stretch my legs. The air was unseasonably cold for July, and I shivered as I walked toward the building. A bell chimed as I pushed open the door, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. The interior was brightly lit and looked like any other small-town convenience store. Racks of snacks, coolers full of drinks, and sundry automotive supplies. What struck me as odd, though, was that there were about a dozen people milling about inside. It seemed strange for such a remote location, especially at this hour. I made my way to the counter, where a middle-aged woman with graying hair stood staring blankly ahead. "Evening," I said with a smile. "Could I get $40 on pump 1, please?" She didn't respond or even seem to register my presence. I was about to repeat myself when I noticed that everyone in the store had stopped moving. They all stood perfectly still, staring in my direction with vacant expressions. A chill ran down my spine. "Hello?" I called out tentatively. No response. That's when the lights began to flicker. At first I thought it was just faulty wiring, but the pattern quickly became too regular to be random. On for 3 seconds, off for 2. On for 3, off for 2. With each cycle, the darkness seemed to last a little longer. I turned back to the clerk, hoping for some explanation, but she was gone. In fact, everyone was gone. The store was suddenly, inexplicably empty. Panic gripped me. I sprinted for the door, my heart pounding in my chest. But as I reached for the handle, the lights went out completely. I was plunged into a darkness so absolute it felt like a physical weight pressing down on me. I fumbled blindly, desperately searching for the door. My fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. The handle! I yanked it hard, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. That's when I heard it. A low, rhythmic humming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It started soft but grew steadily louder, vibrating in my bones. Along with the sound came a smell, acrid and chemical, like burning plastic. I pounded on the door, screaming for help, but my voice sounded muffled and distant, as if I were underwater. The humming intensified, drowning out everything else. I felt dizzy, disoriented. The smell was overwhelming now, making it hard to breathe. Just as I thought I might pass out, there was a deafening crack, like a bolt of lightning striking right next to me. A blinding white light flooded the store. I squeezed my eyes shut, but it seared through my eyelids. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. I found myself standing outside next to my car, gasping for air. The night was calm and quiet, stars twinkling overhead. The gas station looked exactly as it had when I'd first pulled in, old but ordinary. Shaking, I climbed into my car and peeled out of there as fast as I could, not caring that my tank was still nearly empty. I drove away, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had I fallen asleep at the wheel and dreamed the whole thing? But it had felt so real, and I could still smell that acrid scent clinging to my clothes. It wasn't until the next afternoon, when I finally stopped at another gas station hundreds of miles away, that I discovered something that made my blood run cold. As I went to pay, I realized my wallet was missing. I searched my car frantically, but it was nowhere to be found. The last place I remembered having it was in that strange store. I've spent months trying to rationalize what happened that night. I've looked up that stretch of highway, trying to find some record of the gas station, but there's nothing. According to maps, that area is completely uninhabited for miles in every direction. I've thought about going back, trying to find some proof of what I experienced. But the truth is, I'm terrified of what I might discover. Part of me hopes I simply lost my wallet somewhere else, and my overtired brain conjured up an elaborate hallucination. Story 2. I've always been fascinated by small towns. There's something about their tight-knit communities and hidden histories that draws me in. But after what happened last fall, I'm not sure I'll ever look at them the same way again. It was late October, and my best friend Jake and I were on a road trip through the Midwest. We'd been driving for hours, taking back roads and scenic routes, enjoying the fall colors and small-town charm. As evening approached, we found ourselves somewhere in northern Missouri, surrounded by endless fields and rolling hills. The weather had turned nasty. A steady drizzle had given way to sheets of rain that made it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. To make matters worse, my phone had died, taking our GPS with it. Jake's phone showed no service. We were well and truly lost. "I think we should try to find a town," Jake said, peering through the rain-streaked windshield. "Maybe grab a bite to eat and wait out this storm." I nodded, squinting at a faded road sign as we passed. "Looks like there's a place called Millbrook about 10 miles ahead. Let's check it out." As we drove on, the rain intensified. Thunder rumbled in the distance and flashes of lightning illuminated the darkening sky. I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. Something about this area felt off. Finally, we saw lights ahead. A battered wooden sign welcomed us to Millbrook, population 243. The main drag was barely 2 blocks long, a handful of weathered buildings huddled together against the gloom. We pulled up in front of what looked like a diner, its neon open sign flickering weakly in the window. As I killed the engine, I noticed a group of people standing under the awning of a nearby storefront, staring at us. Their faces were expressionless, almost blank, but there was an intensity to their gaze that sent a chill down my spine. "You see those people?" I murmured to Jake. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, weird vibe, huh? Maybe we should keep moving." But the rain was coming down in sheets now, and I was exhausted from driving. "Let's just grab some coffee and wait it out." "I'm sure it's fine." We dashed through the downpour to the diner's entrance. A bell chimed as we entered, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet space. The interior was dimly lit and smelled of stale grease and cigarette smoke. A few patrons sat at the counter, but they didn't turn to look at us. In fact, they didn't move at all. We slid into a worn vinyl booth. An elderly waitress shuffled over, notepad in hand. Her eyes were rheumy and unfocused, and when she spoke, her voice was a dry whisper. "What'll it be, boys?" "Just coffee, please," I said, trying to sound friendly. "Nasty weather out there, huh?" She didn't respond, just turned and shuffled back to the kitchen. Jake and I exchanged uneasy glances. "This place gives me the creeps," he muttered. "You ever get the feeling like you're in danger, even when nothing's actually happening?" I nodded. That was exactly how I felt. Like there was a weight pressing down on me, a nameless threat lurking just out of sight. The waitress returned with our coffee. As she set the mugs down, I noticed her hands were shaking. She leaned in close, her voice barely audible. "You boys need to leave, now." Before I could respond, she was gone, disappearing into the back of the diner. I looked at Jake, saw my own confusion and fear mirrored in his eyes. "Let's go," he said. We stood up, leaving a few bills on the table. As we headed for the door, I glanced at the other patrons. They were all staring at us now, their eyes glassy and vacant. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. We burst out into the rain, rushing to the car. But as I reached for the door handle, a voice called out, "Going so soon?" A man stood a few feet away, rainwater streaming down his weathered face. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Those were cold, predatory. We need to get back on the road," I stammered. The man took a step closer. "Oh, I don't think so. You see, we don't get many visitors here in Millbrook, and when we do, well, we like to make them feel welcome." More people were emerging from the surrounding buildings now, moving with an eerie synchronicity. They formed a loose circle around us, their expressions blank but somehow menacing. Jake grabbed my arm. "Run!" We took off down the street, splashing through puddles and nearly losing our footing on the slick pavement. I could hear footsteps behind us, steady and unhurried. They weren't chasing us. They didn't need to. Somehow I knew they were hurting us. We turned a corner and found ourselves in a small park. At its center stood a massive oak tree, its gnarled branches reaching toward the stormy sky. And hanging from one of those branches was a rope, a noose. My blood ran cold. This couldn't be happening. This had to be some kind of sick joke or shared hallucination. But the rain on my skin felt real, and the fear coursing through my veins was all too genuine. The townspeople were closing in now, their faces still eerily blank. The man who had spoken to us earlier stepped forward. "Every few years," he said, his voice calm and matter-of-fact, "Millbrook needs a sacrifice to keep the darkness at bay, to ensure our prosperity." He gestured at the noose. "You boys arrived just in time." I opened my mouth to protest, to plead, but no words came out. Jake was shaking beside me, his eyes wide with terror. Suddenly, a piercing shriek cut through the night. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Not human, not animal, but something other. The townspeople froze, their heads tilting in unison toward the sound. For a moment, everything was still. Then chaos erupted. The earth began to tremble beneath our feet. The great oak groaned and swayed, its roots tearing free from the ground. And emerging from the widening chasm was something. I caught glimpses of writhing tentacles, of eyes that glowed with an unholy light, of a maw lined with row upon row of razor-sharp teeth. The townspeople began to chant in a language I didn't recognize, their voices rising to a fevered pitch. Some fell to their knees, arms outstretched in supplication. Others turned and ran, their screams mingling with the creature's unearthly roar. Jake and I stood rooted to the spot, unable to process what we were seeing. This couldn't be real. It had to be a nightmare. But then one of those massive tentacles lashed out, wrapping around the man who had threatened us. He didn't struggle as it lifted him high into the air, didn't make a sound as it pulled him toward that gaping maw. That broke our paralysis. We ran harder and faster than I've ever run in my life. Behind us, I could hear the sounds of destruction, of buildings collapsing, of people screaming, of that thing roaring its hunger to the storm-racked sky. We made it back to the car somehow, our hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries to get the key in the ignition. As we peeled out of town, I caught one last glimpse in the rearview mirror, of tentacles writhing against the night sky, of a town being torn apart by the very evil it had tried to appease. We drove for hours, not speaking, not stopping, both of us too shaken to do anything but put as much distance between us and Millbrook as possible. When we finally pulled over at a truck stop just across the Iowa border, the sun was starting to rise. Jake looked at me, his face pale and drawn. What the hell was that?" I shook my head. "I don't know, and I don't think I want to know." We've never spoken about that night again. Sometimes I wonder if it really happened, if it wasn't just some shared delusion brought on by exhaustion in the storm. But then I'll catch a glimpse of something on the news. A story about a town wiped off the map by a freak storm, or reports of mass hallucinations in small Midwestern communities. And that feeling of dread comes rushing back. Story 3. I've always been a night owl, preferring the quiet solitude of darkness to the hustle and bustle of daylight. But after what happened last autumn, I find myself dreading the fall of night, my eyes constantly darting to the rearview mirror, searching for something I hope never to see again. It was late October, and I was driving back to Boston after visiting my sister in upstate New York. I'd left later than planned, confident in my ability to navigate the dark roads. As I crossed into western Massachusetts, a dense fog began to roll in, transforming the familiar landscape into something alien and forbidding. The rational part of my brain knew I should find a place to stop for the night, but a nagging sense of urgency pushed me onward. I turned off the main highway, hoping to find a shortcut through the back roads. It wasn't long before I realized my mistake. The fog thickened, reducing visibility to mere feet in front of my car. The road narrowed, twisting through dense forest that pressed in on both sides. I hadn't seen another vehicle or building for what felt like hours. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, every nerve on high alert. That's when it happened. My left headlight flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. I cursed, flipping on the high beams, only to be blinded by the fog reflecting the light back at me. Defeated, I switched back to the single working headlight, squinting into the gloom. As if the universe sensed my vulnerability and decided to pile on, a shudder ran through the car. The engine coughed, sputtered, and the dreaded check engine light blinked to life on my dashboard. No, 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 I muttered, easing the car onto what I hoped was the shoulder of the road. The engine gave one last wheeze and died. I sat there for a moment, listening to the tick of the cooling engine and my own ragged breathing. The silence outside was absolute, broken only by the occasional drip of moisture from the trees. I fumbled for my phone, already knowing what I'd find. No service. With shaking hands, I popped the hood and got out to take a look. The fog seemed to swallow the beam of my flashlight, and an unnatural chill seeped into my bones. I'm no mechanic, but I tightened everything I could reach, hoping against hope that it was just a loose connection. Back in the driver's seat, I turned the key. Nothing. Not even a click. Panic began to set in. I was alone, in the middle of nowhere, with a dead car and no way to call for help. Every horror movie I'd ever seen flashed through my mind, but I knew that wandering off into the woods would be suicide. Better to wait it out until morning. I reclined my seat, wrapped myself in the emergency blanket from my trunk, and tried to calm my racing thoughts. Despite my fear, exhaustion eventually won out, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. I woke with a start, momentarily disoriented. Pale sunlight filtered through the dissipating fog, revealing a scene that made my blood run cold. I wasn't on the side of a lonely forest road anymore. My car was parked on the main street of a small town, directly in front of a looming Victorian house that could have been plucked straight from a Hitchcock film. Houses lined both sides of the street, their windows dark and lifeless. How was this possible? There hadn't been a single light, a single sign of civilization all night. It was as if the town had materialized out of the mist itself. My hands shook as I opened the car door, the creak of hinges unnaturally loud in the stillness. The air felt heavy, oppressive, carrying the musty scent of decay. As I stood there, trying to make sense of my surroundings, movement caught my eye. An old man was shuffling down the sidewalk, head bowed, hands thrust deep in the pockets of a threadbare coat. He passed without acknowledging me, his footsteps making no sound on the cracked pavement. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice sounding thin and reedy in the morning air. "Can you tell me where I am?" He stopped but didn't turn. When he spoke, his voice was a dry whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You shouldn't be here. It's not your time yet." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean? What is this place?" Slowly, he turned to face me. I stumbled back, a scream caught in my throat. Where his eyes should have been were empty, dark sockets, like windows into an infinite void. "This is the waiting place," he said, his lipless mouth barely moving. "The space between. You took a wrong turn, wandered off your path, but it's not too late. You can still go back." Before I could respond, he was gone. Not as if he'd walked away, but as if he'd simply ceased to exist between one blink and the next. Heart pounding, I turned in a slow circle, taking in my surroundings with new eyes. The houses seemed to shift and waver at the edges of my vision, their architecture an impossible blend of styles and eras. And in every window I could see faces watching me, pale, gaunt faces with the same empty eye sockets as the old man. I stumbled back to my car, fumbling with the keys. To my shock, it started on the first try, both headlights blazing to life. I threw it into gear and peeled out, tires squealing on the suddenly slick pavement. As I drove, the rearview mirror showed the town receding into mist, the buildings seeming to fold in on themselves like a collapsing house of cards. I drove for what felt like hours, my hands clenched so tightly on the wheel that my fingers ached. Finally, I saw signs of normal civilization. Gas stations, fast food restaurants, other cars on the road. I pulled into the first rest stop I saw, my legs shaky as I got out of the car. Inside, I approached the bored-looking cashier. "Excuse me," I said, my voice hoarse. "Can you tell me where I am?" She raised an eyebrow. "You're just outside of Greenfield, honey. You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." I laughed, the sound edged with hysteria. If only she knew. I bought a map and spread it out on the hood of my car, tracing the route I must have taken. But no matter how carefully I looked, I couldn't find any sign of the town I'd woken up in. It was as if it had never existed. As I stood there, a gust of wind caught the map, sending it fluttering to the ground. As I bent to retrieve it, something caught my eye. There, stuck in the groove between my hood and windshield, was a single black feather. I reached for it with trembling fingers, but it flew away. Story 4. It was early August, and I was visiting my old college roommate, Mike, at his parents' place in rural Vermont. Mike had converted their old barn into a makeshift recording studio, and we'd spent the last few days working on some tracks for his band's demo. On this particular night, we'd been at it for hours, fueled by cheap beer and the kind of creative energy that only seems to strike after midnight. The main house was dark and quiet, Mike's parents long since gone to bed, leaving us alone with the chirping crickets and the faint hum of equipment. "Hey," Mike said suddenly, his eyes bright with that look that always meant trouble back in our college days. "I've got an idea. Let's take the 4-track out to the old shed." I raised an eyebrow. "The shed? Why?" He grinned, already unplugging cables. "Change of scenery, man. Plus the acoustics in there are wild. Trust me." Against my better judgment, and maybe because of the beer, I agreed. We lugged the equipment across the overgrown yard to a dilapidated wooden structure that looked like it might collapse if you sneezed too hard. Mike jimmied the rusted lock, and we stepped inside. The interior was musty and cluttered, filled with ancient farm equipment and dust-covered boxes. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting deep shadows in the corners. As Mike set up the 4-track, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. "All right," Mike said, handing me a mic. "Let's lay down some vocals. Something raw, you know? Let the vibe of this place inspire us." We started singing, some half-remembered folk song from our college days, our voices echoing off the weathered walls. And for a moment, it was magic. The kind of pure, unfiltered creativity that you can't manufacture. Then it happened. There was a loud pop, and we were plunged into darkness. The light bulb had burst without warning, showering us with tiny shards of glass. We burst out laughing, the sudden shock giving way to nervous hilarity. "Jesus," I gasped, trying to catch my breath. "What the hell was that?" Mike was already packing up the equipment. "No idea, man, but I think that's our cue to call it a night." Back in the relative safety of the barn studio, we decided to listen to our impromptu recording. Mike queued up the tape, and our slightly off-key harmonies filled the room. But as the song progressed, I noticed something odd. "Hey, do you hear that?" I asked, leaning closer to the speakers. Mike frowned, adjusting some dials. "Hear what?" "There's something else. On another track." He isolated the channels, and that's when we heard it. A voice, faint but unmistakable, on a completely separate track from our recording. It was high-pitched, frantic, filled with a terror that made my skin crawl. "I got away!" it screamed. "I got away! I'll show you!" The moment the voice said, "I'll show you," there was a pop on our vocal track. The exact moment the light bulb had exploded in the shed. We sat in stunned silence for a long moment, the tape hissing softly in the background. Finally, Mike spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "What the fuck was that?" I shook my head, trying to process what we just heard. Maybe it picked up a radio signal or something? There are high-tension wires nearby, right? But even as I said it, I knew it didn't make sense. This was a brand new tape, and the mysterious voice was on a completely unrecorded track. Plus, what kind of radio station would be broadcasting something like that at 1 a.m.? We spent the next hour going over the tape, analyzing every second of the recording. But no matter how many times we listened, we couldn't explain what we captured. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, Mike turned to me, his face pale. We need to find out what happened in that shed. The next day, running on coffee and adrenaline, we started digging into the history of Mike's parents' property. We combed through old newspaper archives at the local library, talked to elderly neighbors, even convinced Mike's mom to dig out the original deed to the land. At first, we came up empty. The farm had been in Mike's family for generations, with no reports of anything out of the ordinary. But then we stumbled across a small article from 1952, buried in the back pages of a crumbling local paper. "Escaped patient still at large," the headline read. The story detailed the manhunt for a man who had escaped from a nearby psychiatric hospital. He was described as dangerous and unstable, last seen heading towards the area where Mike's family farm now stood. The article mentioned that the man believed he was being pursued by demonic forces and that he had sworn to show them all before his escape. The search had gone on for weeks, but the man was never found. As we read the faded newsprint, a chill ran down my spine. The words were too similar, too specific to be a coincidence. "We need to go back to the shed," Mike said, his voice grim. This time we went during the day, armed with flashlights and a determination to uncover the truth. The shed looked different in the harsh light of day, smaller, less threatening. But the sense of unease remained. We began searching methodically, moving boxes and old equipment, looking for, well, we weren't sure what. After an hour of fruitless searching, I was ready to give up. That's when Mike called out, "Hey, check this out." He was kneeling in the far corner of the shed, running his hands along the floorboards. As I watched, he pried up one of the boards, revealing a small, dark space beneath. And there, nestled in the dust and cobwebs, was a small, leather-bound journal. With trembling hands, Mike pulled it out. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with cramped, frantic writing. As we flipped through it, a story began to emerge. The ramblings of a man convinced he was being hunted by supernatural forces. The entries grew more paranoid and incoherent as they went on, detailing elaborate plans to escape and show them all. The final entry, dated just days after the man's escape from the hospital, sent a chill through my body. "I've found a place to hide. They won't find me here. I'll wait, and when the time is right, I'll show them. I'll show them all." Mike and I looked at each other, the implications sinking in. Had we somehow captured the voice of a man who had died in this very shed over 70 years ago? A man whose final moments of triumph and defiance had somehow been preserved, waiting for someone to hear them? We never found any physical evidence of what happened to the escaped patient. No bones, no remains. We never recorded in that shed again. In fact, Mike's parents ended up tearing it down later that year, citing structural issues. But we kept the journal and the tape, but we lost it or they disappeared over the years. Story 5. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. Zoe and I had been planning a road trip to the coast for months, a chance to escape the pressures of our jobs and recapture some of that carefree spirit from our college days. We left the city late Friday afternoon, our car packed with snacks, beach gear, and way too much caffeine. The drive took longer than expected, thanks to some nasty construction delays. By the time we rolled into the sleepy coastal town of Millhaven, it was nearly midnight. We were wired from the drive and not ready to call it a night, so after checking into our motel, we decided to seek out the nearest beach. Following the GPS, we wound our way through quiet residential streets until we found a small public beach tucked away between weathered New England cottages. The night was unusually warm for May, with a gentle breeze coming off the water. We kicked off our shoes and waded into the surf, laughing as the cold water shocked our system. For an hour or so, everything was perfect. We took silly pictures, collected seashells, and talked about nothing and everything the way only old friends can. But as midnight slipped into the early hours of the morning, a change came over the night. It started with the fog. One moment the sky was clear, a waxing moon hanging low on the horizon. The next, tendrils of mist were creeping across the sand, thickening rapidly until we could barely see 10 feet in front of us. The temperature dropped, and an eerie silence fell over the beach. "Maybe we should head back," Zoe said, her voice oddly muffled by the fog. I nodded, suddenly uneasy. As we made our way back to the car, I noticed how the streetlights were casting a strange golden glow through the mist. It made everything look slightly unreal, like we were walking through an old sepia-tone photograph. We were almost to the car when we saw the flashing lights. Red and blue strobes cut through the fog, startlingly close. Without a word, we broke into a run, our hearts pounding. We knew we weren't supposed to be on the beach after dark, but the thought of trying to explain ourselves to small-town cops at 2 a.m. was too much to handle. We peeled out of there, tires squealing on the damp pavement. Once we were a few blocks away and it was clear no one was following us, we started to relax. "Okay, that was weird," Zoe laughed, pulling up the GPS on her phone. "Let's get back to the motel and call it a night." According to the app, we were only about 15 minutes from our motel. Easy enough. But as we drove, following the soothing voice of the GPS, things started to get strange. The fog grew thicker, reducing visibility to mere feet in front of the car. We found ourselves on a highway interchange, following signs for Route 1 North as instructed. But after taking the exit and driving for a few minutes, we suddenly found ourselves back on the same interchange, staring at the same sign for Route 1 North. "Did we just go in a circle?" Zoe asked, frowning at her phone. I shook my head, a chill running down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. "That's not possible. We've been driving straight the whole time." We tried again, this time paying closer attention to our surroundings. But somehow, we ended up right back where we started. And again. And again. It was like we were trapped in some kind of loop, always returning to the same stretch of highway, no matter which way we turned. The world outside our car windows became a blur of orange-tinted fog and shadowy shapes that might have been buildings or trees or something else entirely. As we drove, I noticed other unsettling details. There were no other cars on the road, not a single one in what should have been a busy coastal area. The few businesses we passed were all dark and shuttered, their signs unreadable in the mist. Even the houses we saw seemed lifeless, without so much as a porch light burning. "What's going on?" Zoe whispered, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Where is everyone?" I didn't have an answer. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. That's when I remembered something I'd seen online earlier that week. Some fringe religious group had been predicting that the rapture would happen on this very night. At the time, I'd laughed it off. Now surrounded by this unnatural fog and eerie emptiness, I wasn't so sure. "Zoe," I said slowly, what if something really did happen? What if we're the only ones left?" She shot me a look that was equal parts fear and exasperation. "Don't even joke about that. There has to be a logical explanation." But as the hours wore on and we found ourselves driving the same strange routes over and over again, logic seemed increasingly inadequate to explain our situation. It was like we'd slipped into some kind of pocket dimension, a place that looked like our world but wasn't quite right. We tried everything we could think of to break out of the loop. We ignored the GPS and tried to navigate by instinct. We pulled over and waited, hoping the fog would clear. We even tried retracing our route back to the beach, thinking we might be able to reset whatever had gone wrong. Nothing worked. No matter what we did, we always ended up back on that same stretch of highway, staring at the sign for Route 1 North like it was mocking us. As the night wore on, exhaustion and fear began to take their toll. We started to question everything, our memories, our perceptions, even our sanity. Had we somehow slipped into a parallel universe? Were we caught in some kind of time loop? Or was this all just an incredibly vivid shared hallucination? "Maybe we should just keep driving," Zoe suggested as we found ourselves once again at the now familiar interchange. "Pick a direction and go until we hit something different." It was as good a plan as any. We chose a random exit and drove, pushing deeper into the fog-shrouded night. For what felt like hours, we saw nothing but the same indistinct shapes looming out of the mist. And then suddenly, something changed. The fog began to thin, and familiar landmarks started to appear. Before we knew it, we were pulling into the parking lot of our motel, approaching from the opposite direction we should have been coming from. We sat there for a long moment, engine idling, trying to process what had just happened. According to the dashboard clock, it was 3:30 a.m. We'd been lost in the fog for over 3 hours. "Did that really happen?" Zoe asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know how to answer. Part of me wanted to rationalize it all away. We were tired. We got turned around in an unfamiliar area. The fog played tricks on our perception. But deep down, I knew we'd experienced something that defied rational explanation. For the rest of our trip, things seemed normal. We explored the town, enjoyed the beach, ate too much seafood. But there was an undercurrent of unease that we couldn't shake. Every time the fog rolled in, we found ourselves on edge, half expecting to slip back into that strange, in-between place. We've talked about that night many times since then, trying to make sense of what happened. We've pored over the photos we took, searched for any reports of similar experiences in the area. But we've never found any satisfying answers.
Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.